students tend to struggle a little bit with approaches, and I struggle with finding a way to make them interesting. So basically what you need to know about the approaches before we even get started here would be that depending on the approach that you take, depending on the focus you have, that's kind of what it's looking at, you're going to explain situations differently. So for example, aggression. Somebody from a biological perspective would explain aggression, maybe the causes, the reactions, the continuation of it, much differently than somebody from a cognitive perspective or a sociocultural perspective. So it's important to learn the keywords or findings related to each approach in order to be able to differentiate between them, which is the ultimate goal. So again, it's hard to kind of find a way to make this interesting for you guys. So last night I was at whatever that new yogurt, orange, whatever yogurt shop is, or ice cream shop, and I ran into some students, and Mackenzie ran up and she's like, "Dom, tell me a story." And when I sat down this morning to try to think about how to make approaches interesting, I thought, well, I don't have a lot of stories, but I just got back from hiking in northern Wisconsin and it was absolutely beautiful. And I thought to myself, well, how can I make that into a story that can also teach you the approaches to psychology? See, that's me there thinking as I look at the waterfall. And I decided on risk-taking. So I'm going to focus on risk-taking. See, we have the crossing there. So as I look at the concept of risk-taking, we're going to analyze risk-taking from each of the different perspectives, as you guys can see on the right again. So how would somebody from a biological perspective explain risk-taking differently than somebody from an evolutionary perspective? And I am somebody who tends to, I guess, take a lot of risks. So I have a friend, Erin, and she does not take risks. She doesn't venture off into these beautiful waterfalls the same way that I do. And, I'm crossing logs and I'm, standing down on rocks a foot away from where the water is and all of these different things throughout these photos because I tend to be a bit of a risk taker. There's a log that I attempted to cross, fell off of into the water, although I made it across later. There I am. So, how would somebody from each of these perspectives explain risk-taking? Somebody from a biological perspective, we will start there. The biological perspective looks at all that sciencey stuff, how the body and brain are going to enable emotions, memories, and your experiences, your sensations. And they're also going to look at how our genes will combine with our environment to influence individual differences. That's going to be different from evolutionary because we're talking about genes combining with environment and influencing what makes us different from each other. So, somebody from this perspective is trying to analyze my risk-taking behaviors. I'm seen there down by a rushing water, which was not all that safe, and my friends weren't too happy there. But somebody from a biological perspective might say, let's look at the parts of her brain, her amygdala, for example, which is a brain part that involves emotions such as fear. Maybe I don't have as many signals firing to make me fearful of these different situations versus maybe my friend Erin, who has a lot of signals firing as she is approaching these different risk-taking situations. And then her amygdala is firing off the signal saying, don't do it, don't take that risk, don't cross that log, or don't walk out onto that rock. Or they might be looking maybe at my frontal lobe, which is sort of my decision maker, and they might say, there's not as much activity in her frontal lobe as maybe Erin's as you're approaching these risk-taking situations. So that's an example of how a biological person, a biological psychologist, would try to understand my risk-taking. Now let's move on to somebody from the evolutionary perspective. Okay, the evolutionary perspective looks at how the natural selection of traits promote the survival of genes. So how does evolution influence our behavior tendencies? That's really the question that they're asking here. So you think of like Charles Darwin with this perspective. And here they might analyze how risk-taking facilitated the survival of my genes. How did taking risks help me promote my genes? So maybe it's taking the risk of walking up to that really cute caveman and saying, hey, what's your story? Or maybe it's taking that risk of venturing off the trail when I'm hunting and gathering and doing all of those things and finding some of the better foods or things like that that are going to keep me healthier longer or stronger longer or whatever it might be. So that's how an evolutionary perspective would differ. The next one we're going to look at will be the psychodynamic perspective, and they really look at how behavior springs from our unconscious drives and conflicts. Unconscious is our key word here, and that means if it's unconscious, you can't access it, so you don't really know that it's happening. You don't know what's driving you. And this is our Sigmund Freud stuff that we'll learn about quite a bit in future units. So the questions that they're going to ask is, how can someone's personality traits and disorders be explained in terms of sexual and aggressive drives or as the disguised effects of unfulfilled wishes or childhood traumas? Childhood being a key word. So let's focus on maybe unfulfilled things that I have going on in my life. Maybe somebody from a psychodynamic perspective is going to look at my risk-taking behaviors and say, maybe unconsciously she feels really bored with her life or, really trapped in whatever situation she is in right now. And as a result, she has to go out and take big risks to try to feel, excited and fulfilled and happy and all of those different things. So these are the driving factors in her risk taking. And instead of her amygdala or her ancestral promotion of her genes or something like that. So again, just reminding you of the first three, we have the biological, the evolutionary, and the psychodynamic that we started out here. The next approach that we're going to look at will be the behavioral approach, and that's how we learn observable responses. You're going to learn a lot about this with Mr. Ray when he talks about learning and conditioning. So some of the questions they might ask is, how do we learn for example, fears of different objects or situations, or how might we alter our behaviors to lose weight or to stop an addictive behavior or something like that. So behavioral is very external, and people tend to get this one confused. Okay, they're talking about learning from your environment. It might be what you watch, and then you model that behavior. It might be what you're reinforced for. So some positive encouragement that makes you want to do those things more, or some negative experiences that make you want to not try that new thing. So for me, with risk taking, they might look at it and say, let's look at, some of the factors in her life. For example, my dad. I hiked a lot with my dad when I was younger. And when we were hiking, he would always hike out into waterfalls or encourage me to do different things that other people probably wouldn't encourage me to do, to really take some chances. And so I learned to not fear rushing water or different situations. And as a result, I enjoy taking risks. I've learned that taking risks is safe and it's fulfilling. So that would be behavioral. It's how I learn observable responses, how I've learned to take risks. The next one then is cognitive, and that's how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. This one, people tend to get confused with behavioral, and that's confusing to me because behavioral is very external. Cognitive is completely focused on your mind, how your mind is making sense of things, not your brain, right? Because that would be biological. That would be what is the functioning? What's the brain chemistry? Are there chemicals that are off? Are there parts of your brain that is off? Is your nervous system not functioning properly with each other? And cognitive is totally different. This is the thinking part. Okay, so how do we use information in remembering, storing, solving problems, reasoning, thinking through things? So somebody from a cognitive perspective, then when they're looking at my risk-taking behaviors, they're going to say, well, how does she decide whether or not to take a risk? How does she decide whether or not to, cross a certain stream or something like that? So, for example, when I was looking at crossing this log, which, as I told you guys previously, I tried to cross it and I fell into the water. Eventually I succeeded. You can see that this is not a heavy stream. There's not a lot of rapids. It's not going to take me away. It's probably not going to kill me. We're looking at maybe 2 feet of falling into this lovely little stream here. So as a result, as I thought through that, as I processed that, as I thought back on, previous times that I had maybe tried to do these things, when I decided to take the risk of crossing it, to me it wasn't a huge risk. Okay, now I wouldn't have made that same decision as I looked at these rapids here. Okay, this was if you were standing down there, I literally could not hear my friends as they were yelling to me to get away from the edge of the rock. So I took the risk of getting right up to the rock, but am I going to crawl out onto this log? Not a chance, okay, because I really don't want to get rushed away by the rapid waters there, which I would have. It would kill you if you fell into that. And I remember standing on the edge of that rock, my heart was beating fast, and I was thinking about those things. That is cognitive. Okay? Humanistic then is our next one, and the humanists are Maslow and Rogers, and you'll learn about those more with me later, but they're looking at how we meet our needs for love and acceptance and achieve self-fulfillment. How do we become the best versions of ourselves? How are we happy? How do we get our needs met? And if we don't get our lower level needs met, like safety and food and acceptance and things like that, can we really become the best version of ourselves? So they're going to ask, how do we work toward fulfilling our potential? How can we overcome barriers to our own personal growth? And as you apply that to risk-taking, for me, for example, when I look at nature and hiking and camping and all of these things, nothing makes me feel happier. Nothing makes me feel better or any of those things. And maybe when I look at taking that risk, I think about the fact that I'm not always going to be able to go out and take these risks. I'm not always going to be able to walk out to the edge of a waterfall or across a rushing stream or hike through these areas off trails that are definitely not all that safe sometimes. And so as a result, I feel like if I can do that now, and I'll have these pictures to look back on and these experiences that I log into my memory, that really makes me feel fulfilled. It really makes me feel happy. And I have people in my life who support that. I have friends who hike out to these trails, with me, although some of them stayed back and played Scrabble. But I have people who are going to support me in that, who aren't going to say, ooh, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, be careful, don't take that risk, don't cross that bridge. No, instead I have people who are saying, be safe, be careful, go ahead and try it. The next one that we have to look at then is sociocultural. This is our last one, and that one looks at how our behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. Okay, so that's really looking at how do your peers influence you? How do your parents influence you? How does media, how does being raised in Madison, Wisconsin differ from being raised in Mellon, Wisconsin, which is where I was hiking, and it was a very different culture. Okay, or how does being raised in the United States differ from being raised in South Africa or Brazil or places like that? And how is that going to influence the behaviors that we're going to see? So if we look at risk-taking, to me, this was a huge risk, right? Venturing out to the edge of a small rock and deciding how close to get to the rushing water, or whether or not to cross a tree that's been downed, or whether or not to go on the trail or off the trail, or hike all the way up to the top or not. All of those different things, to me, my heart is beating fast, my palms are getting sweaty. I was nervous yet excited, right? Now, if I was raised in the Amazon, this might be part of my life every single day. So am I going to feel this rush? Am I going to be as happy when I stumble upon nature that to me is so beautiful? That it's literally life-changing when I try to think about relaxation and all of those different things? Probably not. Okay, so what is a risk to me in these different pictures and images might not be a risk-taking behavior elsewhere, right? So sociocultural is really just looking at all the different factors that are going to influence that same behavior or that same thought or action. So as we bring this together here, again, we have the 7 different approaches to psychology, and each one of these approaches is very different. Okay, again, when you look at the focus, try to look at each one and say, well, how would that be different if I were a psychodynamic theorist, or if I viewed things through more of a humanistic lens. And that's what we're going to work on as we get into our different application examples.